Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. I do not need to tell this audience that launching and sustaining a publication, let alone a design publication, is hard work. Finding writers and building an audience, designing the site or the printed publication, and securing the funds to produce it all, especially in today's media landscape, can be tricky. Off the top of my head, I can think of dozens of design publications that have come and gone in the last decade. It's never been easier in many ways to launch a new publishing platform, but it's also never been harder to sustain it. This is why Moss Context has always been interesting to me. Launched in 2009 by architect Iker Gil as a thematic printed journal, Moss Context has evolved into, as Iker says, a platform that commissions and shares relevant ideas, proposals, and experiences that connect diverse disciplines and place. In addition to the journal, they now publish online on their website, they host events and other activities. So for this episode, I asked Iker on the show to talk about the evolution of Moss Context and the challenges and opportunities in design and architecture publishing. In addition to Moss Context, Iker runs Moss Studio, which is a more traditional architecture practice, but you'll hear traditional is a very expansive word here. And he's also the executive director of the SOM Foundation. In this conversation, we talk about how these different activities fit together. We talk about the role of organizing and administration in his work and how his publishing work has evolved with his own architectural practice. A transcript for this episode, as with all of our episodes, is available to Patreon supporters. Scratching the Surface is made possible because of our Patreon, because of listeners like you who help support the show each month. Supporters get bonus interviews, an exclusive monthly newsletter, and all sorts of other bonus content. Students can support the show for just $3 a month, and then we also have 2 additional tiers for $5 and $10 a month for additional content, early episode previews, and more. You can visit patreon.com/Surface Podcast to sign up and get immediate access to all of this content. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Iker Gil. I want to begin this conversation talking about Moss Context, which you started in 2009, which you describe on the website. You just launched a new version of the website, which looks great. By the way, maybe we can talk about that too. But you describe this as a platform that commissions and shares relevant ideas, proposals, and experiences that connect diverse disciplines and place. And a lot of this, for me at least, the way I sort of came to it was around this quarterly journal that you publish, but it's also online platform, it's event series. You're kind of doing all of these different things under the name Moss Context. And I'm wondering if we could go back to 2009 and you talk a little bit about sort of where you were professionally when you started this, what you were interested in, why you wanted to do this, and then also sort of contextually in architecture and design publishing, what was going on? What was the sort of gap, or what were you missing that you thought you had to kind of start this new thing?
That's a great question. So in 2009, I had basically started my architecture practice, Moss Studio. I had worked in Chicago for about 3 years, and I had worked in architecture practices. And at that point, I had decided that I wanted to go on my own and explore a few things that they were limiting within the context of an architecture practice, and I didn't want to do that, after hours or things like that. So
Right.
it was just to me, it made a lot of sense to start both the architecture practice maybe as a more traditional structure at the same time that I could start Moss Context as this platform that basically would allow me to collaborate with people and show the work of others in a way that was not related to anything that I was doing. I was much more interested in having the work of others. So at that point, I had published a book about the transformation of Shanghai that came out in 2008,
Right.
where the structure for that book really was the structure for the quarterly journal. So in the book about Shanghai, it looked at one specific topic, in this case, the city of Shanghai, and it had different topics or like different ways of bringing or thinking about that that topic. So we had essays, we had diagrams, we had photography, we had many other types of content, or had the way we would communicate ideas. And then the contributors came from very different backgrounds. So some of them were residents that live in the city. Some of them they were documentary, filmmakers working in the city. Other ones were academics. So this idea of bringing people from different disciplines, using different tools to communicate ideas, and but all concentrated on one topic, was really the structure of then mass context. So it started as a quarterly journal. We were very fast paced. We were very interested in, again, I'm very curious about the extensive network of, who shapes the built environment, who's involved. I
Mm.
mean, my training is in architecture, but very interested in graphic design and photography and many other disciplines. So this was kind of like a great vehicle to look
Yeah.
for those collaborators and then just
Yeah.
find ways of coming together.
It's funny that you describe it like that, because that's in many ways how I see this show also, except I don't see this as like separate from my work, but it's like, what are all the questions that I'm wrestling with in my other work? And then I'll talk to people smarter than me on the show about
Hmm.
how they do it so I can understand it. And it's like, oh, I'm interested in architecture. I'm interested in photography or urban planning. Like, oh, let me just kind of talk to those people. And so how did that, I mean, I guess, how did that, you said that this was sort of separate from your work. Um, can you talk a little bit about how those relate? You have this studio that you just opened after working in an office, and then you're doing this journal. What was happening at the studio at that time? Was this were they in dialogue at all?
I think they were, yeah, they were really in dialogue. I think the big piece was that maybe as a designer, I didn't always have the solutions to the projects that I was, or the ideas that I was interested in. So I
Mm,
wasn't trying to force my perspective on that, and I was more interested in collaborating with others to think about different ways of approaching it. So to me, it was just that way of separating the idea of the designer as the person who perhaps gives the solution or the approach to someone who maybe enables to have that conversation about topics that I was personally
mm,
interested,
mhm.
but I wanted to expand maybe the way we could think about them. Um, there were, I think if you look at the work that I was doing, I was interested in, things like Marina City, living in Chicago. There were some collaborators that then they feature in mass context. I think there was like it wasn't a hard line, but the line that maybe was harder, it was just that it wasn't a client request or a client driven project.
Right.
Nobody was commissioning anything. It was just the idea of kind of like the network of people that we had collaborated, but then think about something that was more open.
You did the book on Shanghai that you edited. Had you done much editing? Had you done much publishing? Can you talk a little bit about sort of where those skills or that sort of interest came in here? Because you mentioned earlier you studied architecture, you were working as an architect. What about this sort of publishing and editing side?
Yeah. So I studied architecture. I grew up in Bilbao, but I studied architecture in Barcelona as Bilbao didn't
Okay.
have an architecture school. So I moved there when I was 18. And it was a kind of like a very interesting moment in Barcelona. There was a lot of architecture coming up in the city. This was post the Olympics, but there's a huge tradition of publishing in the city. So whenever there
Mm.
will be a building coming up, there will be also like a book. Some of the
Uh,
publishing companies had a bookstore, and they would organize exhibitions. They would organize book launches. So there was this very interesting cultural environment around the idea of architecture. And you had Akhtar, which still goes on, and Gustavo Gili, and many other publications. So that's where I got exposed to this idea
I
of
see.
maybe the cultural, environment that expanding. And to me, it was thrilling. Both the idea of the book, the object of the book, but also the book as a tool to bring people together, and how some of the content of the book would turn into exhibitions or an opportunity to collaborate and talk to other people. So that's really where that work came from. Not necessarily in any way that I really studied in architecture.
Did you see that? work, the publishing, the editing, the writing, the sort of, I don't know, I mean, maybe you could call it like the cultural production around the buildings themselves, and even the work that you're doing at Mass Context. Do you see that as a type of architecture? Is that a, are there skills from the your architecture education that are kind of playing a role in how you think about and do that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, when you're as a design practice, or when you think about how you would approach a building, there are certain elements that you have to take into consideration, and certain conversations that you need to have, certain um, investigations that you need to do. You need to collaborate with people. I think it's just, in some cases it takes the shape of a built work, and in other ones it just
Right.
becomes a book or it becomes an exhibition. But I think it's always about that idea of, what is the topic at hand, like what are you curious about, what are the people that need to be involved in really exploring that topic. And when I think about some of the build work that I've done, I also collaborate with people. I decided
Right.
that all the work that I would do as part of my studio, it's in collaboration with someone else.
Right.
Sometimes it's architects, sometimes it's artists or photographers. So to me, I don't have a distinction really in the way I approach the projects. It's just that it takes different shapes. I need different collaborators for those outcomes,
Hmm.
and also obviously there is a certain medium. That it's not the same thing to have the pace to read
Right.
online versus read in print or in an exhibition. But those are they don't differ maybe in the way I approach the project.
I want to come back to that last thing you said about sort of reading online versus in print versus an exhibition, but I want to pick at something that you said, that the sort of collaboration with Mass Context and the collaboration with the studio, you don't see a distinction there. It's just that the outputs maybe are different. And you mentioned earlier that you see you founded the studio as a more sort of traditional kind of architecture practice, which makes sense to me. But it's also interesting to kind of scroll through the portfolio site and to see exhibitions and installations and essays and publications and all of those sit on the studio site.
They do.
can
Um,
you can you talk about that, and can you sort of talk, I'm really interested in this idea of like the genesis of the project and finding its form. What does this take? Is it an exhibition, an essay? Is it a conversation? How do you kind of think about that, or how does that evolve in your work under the context of the studio?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question because when you look at the output of both places, there is clearly an overlap. So it's not like the mass studio is just like the architecture of as getting new buildings or
Right.
or renovations, and then the exhibitions show up in the other place. I think it's maybe the ones that were more driven by my interest, where I was able to also fulfill the design strategy. I wouldn't call it a solution, just that I was able to put my voice in the way I could present the work,
Mhm.
versus the other ones that Mass Context was much more of the open platform, that I was creating the space for the voices of others to show up there. So I split it that more than I do through the
Oh, that's
actual
interesting.
outcome, because if you look at the outcome, it's very similar. So in the case of the Shanghai transforming, maybe it's the biggest overlap there, because it's probably how I would approach issues later on. But at that point, that was the only one that I had done. In some other exhibitions, I was the one who was driving that conversation. Or even when we did, I don't know, Exhibit Columbus with Mimi Seiger, that
Mhm.
was a specific commission from someone else. Even it takes installations or exhibitions. So I think, or the US Pavilion, for example, like those are external projects that come to me as part of a larger team, but I get commissioned to do that. So I think it's the genesis of how the projects come to be, and where my voice is needs to be more at the forefront versus maybe on
Right.
the background, where I see the distinction. I would also say that this made more sense maybe at the beginning, and then at the like where we are currently with Mass Context and some of the other projects. I mean, the Mass Context has grown so much into other things that it's I think my role has been slightly different about how I can contribute to that conversation.
Yeah, so let's talk about that actually, because I'm curious. I want to again go back to 2009 for a second, and this idea of starting a print journal, sort of as it's at the core at the beginning. And 2009 is such an interesting time to do something print with. The iPad would come out the next year. There's blogging. There's all this sort of discussion around what is the role of print. Can you talk a little bit about the decisions to do something that was print, that was quarterly, that was bound and had a form, and the challenges that came with that decision then, and then how that has evolved over the last 13 years to include an online platform, events. Can you just talk a little bit about that evolution? That's the sort of early idea there.
Sure. So I always come from when we were talking before about the idea of Barcelona and the publishing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I was always very interested in the idea of the book as an object, and there's a certain sequence, there is a certain format for the conversations. It's not the same thing to have a newsprint versus a hardcover versus some the sizes of
Yeah.
the book. So to me, those conversations took a shape and took an object, and I was attracted to the idea of the book as an object. So even that at that point we had the capacity to do everything online, it really just started as the intention of having a print book that, for maybe lack of technical capacities, it became a website that you could download the PDF. But again, with this idea that the PDF had a sequence, have a pacing, there is a certain relationship between one article and the next, and it was just a place to download that as a way to expand how people would access that content. But it was always intended to be um, print. At that
Mm,
moment, also there was a lot of opportunities to do print on demand, like
right.
you had Lulu, and I can't remember if Blurb was there at
Blurb.
that
Yep.
time, but there were all these tools that you would be able to do it. And to me, it just gave a freedom to say, hey, we can print certain copies the way we think about it, even if perhaps that was not the way we couldn't control the paper the way we wanted or certain things, but there was something tangible. There was something that also that you could give to people, or that you could put in a library, or you could
Mm-hmm.
find in places that perhaps you were not looking for them. In many cases, like when you go online, like, okay, sure, if you're searching for it, you will find
Right.
it, but you don't have that encounter that you go to a bookstore, you go out to a library, and it's there. So the print to me serves a certain purpose. Also, the way I particularly read, I get very distracted by reading online, like
Yeah,
books. So
you and me both. Yeah.
yeah, so I was like, I can read articles, I can read things, but I don't read like a full book. So I need like no distractions. So to me, there's a place for print, and there's also like a huge value of online. So we did that for several years, and then as a print on demand, and we were lucky after a few years to get support from the Driehaus Foundation and the Grant Foundation, that
Mm.
it helps us to get a small amount of money that would allow us to change from print on demand to print locally at Graphic
Ah.
Arts
Yeah.
Studio. And that made a huge impact. But all of the sudden, we were able to control the way we wanted to print, the way we
Mm-hmm.
wanted to do certain things. And so I think that was a key moment, maybe to say, hey, we have ambitions about the content, now we can also have the ambitions about print. Yeah, and that kind of like started as it still was quarterly issues. We wanted to have this fast pace, we wanted to to work with a lot of people, and it kind of like served fine. But what we realized is like that those collaborations didn't have to have a specific topic. Topic is like
Right.
it was bounding and constraining in certain ways, that maybe there were other people that we wanted to work with. And maybe I think at that point I was very, very interested in saying, how does this work, how do these publications can have an impact in bringing people together in Chicago. I mean, my
Mm-hmm.
primarily interest at that point was, and still is Chicago. So it's like I started to think, how can we use this network of people that we are building together, from graphic designers to the contributors, to to find a place and to find moments to come together. So that's how the idea of the events started, which I think it was like about 2 years after we started the print publication. We started to do projects and events here in Chicago.
How did that sort of shift from something printed to something that was, you have something printed, but you were also doing events to then publishing online. How did that change how you think about audience or reader or participant or even community, to use your word?
Mhm.
And Chicago is so central to Mass Context. It's so central to your work, and on the site you say we're based in Chicago but our views are global. And I'm interested in sort of how you think about that as something that's very rooted in Chicago, that is reflective of Chicago in some way, but is also, has a community that's international.
I think that comes more also from my personal experience. I mean, I didn't grow up in I didn't grow up in
Mhm.
Chicago. I grew up in Spain, and Spain my first like 25 years in Spain. So when I came to Chicago, to me there was also a value about being like I'm an outsider in a way.
Right, right.
From one thing or another, when I've lived almost 20 years in Chicago, so but I'm still an outsider, and I think that idea of also being a bridge of connecting great things that are happening in Chicago to outside, but also certain issues or topics that might be interesting in Chicago, but approached from an outsider perspective, I think it's very valuable. So to me, that idea of bringing the best from both worlds has been present. But the other part about contributing to Chicago is like, to me, as a practicing designer of any capacity or any citizen in a way, when you're in a city, you have to find ways of contributing to that city.
Mm.
To me, it was that role was maybe the publications, organizing events. I think for other people might be just attending lectures. For other people might be just mentoring. I think everybody has ways that they can contribute, that they feel, that they have the right skills, the right um, time, and
Mhm.
they can commit to it. But it's important to me. That's something that's like, it's important to contribute to the place where you practice, where you live, and that you make it better for you
Yeah.
practicing, but
Yeah.
also for the next generation to see that there are other options. Um, so those two things have been, I think have been key, like finding the elements that were interesting to me, and also having that outsider perspective, and saying that yes, there are great things in Chicago, but there are many other great things happening outside. That conversation is important. And also, not everything is New York, not everything is LA. There are
Right.
great things in Chicago that we have to export to other places beyond pizza, Mies, and I don't know, Al Capone and Michael Jordan. So
Right. Wait, there's more to Chicago than that?
no,
That's
there is
it?
not. We're just kidding. That's it.
Yeah. Oh, as you're saying that, it has me thinking about something that I'm not totally sure I can phrase into a coherent question, but I'm really fascinated by what you're talking about, that the way you felt you could contribute was through sort of this organizing, basically organizing publications, organizing events, organizing, getting people together. And then you're also talking about like where your point of view kind of comes in, and I'm curious how you think about that, if that makes sense. Sort of, I'm interested in this idea of organization and
Hmm.
organizing and bringing people together, and how that sort of fits in with the work that you do, that is a like Iker Gil project or a Moss
Yeah,
Studio project.
yeah.
How you kind of think about that.
Well, I mean, I think it's organizing is an interesting question, because I see that in many cases, to me, I don't see the role. Maybe as I get older, but the idea that I don't even have to organize many things. Sometimes it's just facilitating things, and I
Ah,
think it's just
uh,
finding aspects that they don't even have to be part of mass context or mass studio, but that I think that are important. And if I can connect two people to do something in Chicago, and I can just make that connection, to me, that's equally important. So the
mm,
kind of like the stamp of the office, it doesn't have to be always completely evident. And the idea of facilitating more than organizing, that might be a better way of talking about it. And
right.
but yeah, I mean, there are people who are great designers, great architects, and that's their role. There are other people who are great team players in an office that are key for the success. And in my case, I think this idea of bringing people together has been something that either maybe it didn't come natural, but that's the way that my career has evolved, and it's been great. And then a lot of the things, or for say like 100% of the things that I've done, they are done in collaboration in one way or another with other people. So, but I have that capacity, I guess, for explaining what I think it's a gap and an opportunity to explore, and then perhaps convince people that to be part of that and find ways to do it. And I think that's where mass context, when you were talking before about how it has evolved, I mean, it's evolved more in less of associating it with a quarterly print publication and
Right.
more this idea of this network, this platform that can bring people together to talk about things that are important. And sometimes they are the books, sometimes they are an installation, sometimes they are, many other formats, many other events. And it's become messier but much more interesting because you can find a strange trajectory of
Yeah.
people showing up in different times, and it's kind of an amazing complicated way of,
Yeah.
of explaining what we do.
Yeah. I mean, I want to change, I want to sort of take what you're saying and actually shift it a little bit, because I think this idea of facilitating is actually really, it's a really good word. I think it's a good way to talk about your work at the SOM Foundation, where you're the executive director. You've been since 2019. And so I have two questions there just to kind of set up two more questions. Can you talk about what the SOM Foundation is and what your role as executive director of that is?
Yeah. So the SOM Foundation it's a non-for-profit organization based in Chicago, but it was founded by Skid Moreau in some areas, so SOM,
Mhm.
in 1979. And initially there was they started the fellowship programs in 1981, which typically it had been the traveling fellowship. So they would support
Mm.
emerging designers to travel around the world to experience architecture and structures, to kind of like benefit their education. And they've been doing that for many years. And since 2018, some of that has shifted a little bit to support emerging designers and faculty and students to kind of like concentrate on topics and research around those topics. So instead of supporting an individual person to travel around the world, you support research done within an academic institution that can benefit a larger group of people, and perhaps do things within a studio that they wouldn't do
Mm.
otherwise, that they wouldn't have the means to do that. But it's in a way started by the firm, but it's separate from the activities, the architectural activities of the firm, but it's this commitment to support education and early practitioners to develop their career.
And so what is your role there? Like, what are you doing as executive director, and how does that connect, or how does that diverge from things you're thinking about at Moss Context, for
Yeah.
example?
It's interesting because in a strange way, to me, it complements some of the work that I'm doing. So as an executive
Yeah.
director in the first kind of like 3 years, a lot of that I've done is actually research the work that had been done in the past, celebrate the fellows, showcase their work, and build. We created a new website and build the
Mhm.
archive of what people had done, in part to showcase their work, and in part to be able to build a network of the fellows. Many of them didn't know who came before them. Maybe many of them didn't know who came after them, because there was not a digital presence. So this idea of showcasing the work that had been done in a way to build that network, to me, was important. But which in a way, like it overlaps with what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
this case, is through supporting with other means, research, and it has a different interest. But in a way, it goes from like mass studio, where I'm much more concentrated on how I personally contribute as a designer, as an architect. Mass
Mhm.
context as a platform where we build this community together. It has much more limited resources, and it's much more nimble, and which also allows for many other opportunities. And I think with the SOM Foundation, it's a much more structured way through 5 different type of awards that we offer annually. But
Mm.
you have the means to support emerging students and practitioners in different ways. So it's part of a to me it's part of the spectrum of how you can contribute and support all those who are coming after you.
This is a weird question, but I'm interested in sort of the administrative side of both the foundation and context, and how that how that influences how you think about the design work, or the there's I'm making a false split here between sort of administration and like creative or theoretical or scholarly work or research work. But how does being somebody who has to kind of think through this structurally and systematically change the kind of theoretical work?
Well, yeah, I think it's not split. I mean, I think to be able to do the fun things, you have to do the
Right.
behind the scene things. So I think maybe that's something that people need to understand. You know, when we did
Yeah.
the book about Ensemble Studio for Mass Context, it was a great book. It was a great collaboration with Anna Morton, Rick Valicenti for the graphic
Hmm.
design, but then with
Hmm.
James Florio for photography, and it's all that amazing collaboration and discussions. But in the end, it's also like you have to go to the printer. You have to, when someone buys the book, you need to respond to that purchase. You make the box. I walk in up with a backpack to the post office and I ship it. And so the the non-fancy behind the scene thing are what makes it actually in a
Right.
way viable, because if I
Right.
had a distribution for that book, for example, that I had to pay X amount of money or percentage of the sales, we would never be able to do that book because there are no margins in that book, for example. So
Hmm.
there are certain aspects in the way you structure your work that allow you to do the work itself. So
Right.
to
Right.
me, being able to, at the SOM Foundation, to be able to create that network, it also requires that you have to create the website to look through the archives, to email every fellow to get their files. There is no next step if you don't have the foundational
Right.
aspect of it. And I don't take that as the negative part of the job. I just think it's like I'm excited to see what is the potential of the foundation or mass context, where I want to go, and there are those steps that you need to fulfill. And with mass context, that was the reason to have the new website. I mean, we've got to a point that we had a clear idea about how to do print
Hmm.
publications, but we had a website for 10 years that served us great.
Right. Yeah.
But technology has changed, the work we do changes, and we had stretched that to the limit. So the interest the interesting conversation that we had with Span for the website was not only how do you make it fancier, but how does it support the work that we want to do and highlight the archives. And it's it's a tool now to do things that
Hmm.
otherwise we couldn't do.
That's actually like a really interesting way to kind of talk about how you sustain a publication for 13 years. And you're talking a little bit
With a lot
about
of white hair.
yeah, right, exactly. And you're talking about like the systems that you need to put in place, the kind of structure, the infrastructure there, about sort of evolving with technology. Could you I'm interested to hear you sort of zoom out a little bit and just kind of architecture discourse more generally has changed so much as more and more things are moving online, as there's new publications starting. How you see sort of the way we talk about architecture and design, or the way it's written about, or the way it's published, how has that evolved generally, and then how have you kind of thought about navigating that with Moss context?
Well, I think maybe going back to that 2009 and the experience of doing the book about Shanghai, to me, doing the book about Shanghai taught me a lot about how I wanted to do the work, but also the way I would want to, um, who were the gatekeepers, who were controlling maybe those voices, or even the challenge to find a publisher. It wasn't like a streamline. I was very happy that Akhtar published the book, but it also took a year since the book was done to even when they decided to send it to print. And there were certain structures that maybe they could be more agile, I would say. So at that point, also because of the economic crisis, a lot of people didn't have jobs. So you
Right.
could see that a lot of architectural practice started to doing publications, and they did one issue or they did two issues,
Mhm.
or they started interviewing people. But then, as more jobs came, they all faded and they all disappeared.
Yep.
Some other publications that were independent, they got bought by someone else. That in a year or two they folded. So it was an interesting time to start a publication that was in a way independent. It wasn't associated with any university. It wasn't coming from a successful practice. I mean, I started the publication at the same as I was starting the practice with no clients.
Right.
So I wasn't banking on the resources or the name of another element. Um, but it was an interesting time. There were amazing, initiatives. I think with iPad and digital, there were many tests that happened, and a lot of them have gone. They disappear,
Yeah.
after 2 3 years. Maybe for good or for bad. I'm very stubborn, so I don't. Once I start something, I try not to quit. So that's how it stayed until now. But it also meant to me that it had to evolve.
Right.
Print or like publications was one way, but as I said, like it has to take different shapes. In that time, I mean, about your question about how it has changed, there are a lot of books that come out. Universities has many universities, they have student publications, which they are great. But there are many people that don't fit in any of these institutional structures. They're not students of these fancy universities that they have books. They don't have access to publishing for publishing. To publish in a lot of publishing
Hmm.
companies, you have to bring also some sources. Not
Hmm.
everybody can get a grant to support that. So I think there are a lot of great existing structures, and there are also a lot of great people who have very interesting things to say that they would benefit from finding other structures. In some cases they want to do it, and in some cases they can contribute, but they're not interested in creating that structure. So to me, I see mass context as one other place where I'm trying
Yeah.
to, maybe, I wouldn't say if it lower that threshold, just find other ways to collaborate with people that if it fits with the way they want to work, perfect. And if not, and I know other places that they can do it, I'm happy to point out to those. And the more interesting work is out there in a thoughtful way, the better for everybody.
I think that's so exactly right. And not to draw too much of a comparison, but that's what's really important to me about the show is that it's not it's sitting in that in between, the way you're talking about kind of Moss context sitting in the in between. It's not part of an institution. I'm employed by an institution, but this is something separate. It's not for academics, it's not for students, it's not for the profession. It's sort of in the middle of all of those, and that
Mm-hmm.
sort of in between space is really interesting, and is also like the hardest um, to build an audience. I mean, it's like the
Correct.
hardest and the easiest, because like if you're kind of being for everyone, you're also kind of for nobody. How do you kind of think about kind of I mean, I'm sure you've had opportunities to kind of join institutions and to kind of take this, take your work into kind of bigger platforms. That sort of you know desire to stay independent and to kind of stay in between these spaces.
I think that the way I see it, I mean, but you're so right. I mean, being that in between, it's very interesting, and it's also very challenging.
Yeah.
So I think we don't have to glorify or like sugarcoat
Right, I
like,
don't
oh, this
mean,
is
yeah.
also easy and you bring people together. It also means that when you don't have a clear structure, that it's maybe like for a financial model, or even the people who contribute, you have to create the one that works for you, and that takes a lot of time. And for many years, and we still, the projects that we do, we have to figure out, okay, what's the way to support that work. So you end up having to create your own models that support what you're trying to do, and there is like a trial and error.
Yeah.
And I think that in terms of the audiences, there is a general amount of people that might be interested in the way we approach things, and they are, they go along for the ride with any topic and any event. and there might be people that just are interested in one of the topics in the issue and they
Right.
discover mass context because of that. Or we've been doing a lot of events now related to the Nakajin capsule tower, and you
Mm.
can see that there might be a very specific audience for that. So, and to me that's perfectly fine. Like, you just either go along for the whole thing, or you just come across mass context for a specific topic, and that's great too. The
Yeah.
Maybe one aspect that is interesting is that we're trying to do it with a depth that you can revisit that work years later, because the context might change and people might find it for other
Mm.
reasons. And
Hmm.
that that role of the archive, or creating the issues and being properly presented, and one is to, people put a lot of time when they are contributors to write these pieces, to contribute, and I think it's very important to honor that commitment and to always have that work relevant, even if it was published 10 years ago. So, for example, when we did the new website, it's like we went back to 2009 and resized every image and redid everything. So anything that was published in 2009 versus 2022 would look exactly the same and
Right.
uh, would be accessible in similar terms. So, but yeah, like the building the audience and building the structure to do these things are challenging, and we've sometimes we go for support, or for example for mass context as an overall, and but now we're much more project based, where we
Mm.
can figure out models that might just support, like the book for, about ensemble studio, or the installation that we did with loop work at the
Right.
geometry of light. Like, we find that maybe finding um, collaborators or institutional support for specific projects, it's more helpful for us, and also to build those relationships. So I don't we're not bought by an institution, but also you want to collaborate with others that share your mission. So
Right. I I'm curious, we've talked about how all this work that you're doing, Mass Context, the studio and the studio projects, the SOM Foundation, the books, the exhibitions, which we didn't even really talk about, sort of the curatorial work, but that all fits it. That's all a part of this.
yeah, just
Um,
different output, but all part of the
yeah.
world of mass context
and,
and
and
issues.
and and the thing that we're saying, it kind of connects a lot of them, is this idea of facilitation, of creating platforms. I'm wondering if you have a sort of critical project or intellectual thread that connects them all. Is there an interest that kind of goes back to that early architecture education and the kind of more traditional architecture work? Is there something there that connects all of this, whether that is an exhibition you're co-curating, or an issue of Mass Context, or like the light exhibition, or the SOM stuff? How does that all fit together for you, sort of critically or intellectually?
Well, I think even that um, my architecture training was very traditional in architecture, in a way of, you would go to a practice the way we were taught in architecture in Barcelona, which was great, but it was one way of looking at it. I think that expansion of how architectural and a cultural environment around architecture happened there, I think it expanded the way I knew I wanted to practice. So it showed me something different. And there was a curiosity in me that I think mass context and a lot of the work, in a way, it channels, it organizes, it structures that interest. So I look at those as opportunities to collaborate with people. So I make, in a way, no distinction if it's an exhibition, if it's a book, if it's
Right.
but it's I try not to look at like what makes sense as a career, and more about how does this project contribute something. And
uh,
surprisingly, as you build years of work, some of the projects that seem to have no connection, there is a thread for whatever reason, whether it's in the topics that you were interested in, the way you collaborated with people, in that begin to connect them.
Yeah.
So I'm less worried about what all this work, how all this work connects in a tangible way, one after another one. I'm more about doing projects that I think are interesting at a personal level, and working
Yeah.
with people at a personal level, and also like how they might, add to the series of projects that other people are doing.
Mm.
And then maybe like, when you do a lecture and things like that, that's actually a great opportunity to make relationships
Yeah.
that is like,
Yeah.
oh, actually that fits nicely with this, and it's a moment to reflect, or even this conversation is actually interesting to have this opportunity to talk about these
Yeah.
larger ideas that when you're like doing the projects, it's harder to see.
Exactly. That is exactly my goal. So I'm glad that we've succeeded
You've
in this
succeeded. You are a
in this
master at it.
conversation. That is totally the goal of these. So what's next for you? What's like what are you interested in right now, or what projects are you working on now, or what are things that you want to be doing more of?
Well, for the SOM Foundation, I think we are at a great moment now where the archives have been completed. We have all the tools to be able to build onto the network of fellows and the work that they are doing, and become more public and find ways of supporting
Mm.
practitioners in different ways. So we just did a very large event in Stuttgart with different practitioners that we brought there to talk to students, but also come together. So I think it will be interesting to see that as we continue to do the awards program, some of that can be a little bit more visible, because that will allow us to connect with other people that are, again, like-minded, or they might be able to support in a way that they might not want to start the initiative, but we can collaborate with them. I think with mass context, the website has been incredible to
Yeah.
give us a kind of like a boost, and I can't think enough like span. And again, I want to reiterate this idea that a lot of these things, while I might be the more visible
Right.
head, I
Right.
mean, it takes a lot of people to come together in different ways, and some of them are more visible and some of them are less visible, but I think it takes a lot of effort to make these things happen. But the website, it was a tool, an incredible tool to do more things, and it came at the same time that we were trying to do, or that what we're doing, this kind of like reading room in our office, where we have a gallery where we can present the work. We tested it last year. We're doing it this year with the work of
Mm.
Noritaka Minami. So having the print publications, which we're already working on other books. One of them is for photographer David Shaliol, who we've worked in many years. So we're super excited to work with him on this publication. So I think we have now the digital presence. We have the experience of having the book about Ensemble Studio. Um, we're going to collaborate doing more, not quarterly issues, but topic-based issues, which in a
Mm.
way they've turned more into guest-edited issues. And it goes back to
Right.
that idea of um, maybe I no longer have to be the one who drives the topic, but find the people who might be perfect candidates to be the guest editors for issues, because they are already working on topics that are important. They already
Right.
have that network of people, and they just need that space and to do the publication. So that's something. And what I'm interested in, yeah, is just finding ways of supporting people. And I think the example maybe with Jermaine Barnes
Mm.
recently, it helps to exemplify maybe the trajectory of how these projects come together, where Jermaine Barnes and Sohin Rudbari were the guest editors of the Vigilantes issue. And then there was an opportunity to do a project together for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and then we supported Jermaine to do an installation in Spain. So something that starts as a publication, you clearly understand maybe what are the ideas that are driving or interesting Jermaine and Shohin at that point, and then finding ways of continuing to collaborate. Again, sometimes as a full participant, sometimes just making the connection between a festival in Spain and the designer, and then he can do his installation, and we're there to support that. So that longer trajectory is very interesting to me. With my studio, I think, the architecture, the more old school architecture practice, it's a little bit more complicated to do. I think, my career has moved into other directions, but one thing that has been constant, and maybe playing with the what you said before, how everything works together. I mean, I did a project when I moved to Chicago. I moved to Marina City. I was obsessed with this building. I think I love this building. I love the work of Bertrand Goldberg and the ideas that convey. So I was very interested in that, and I worked with photographer Andreas Larsson to document the work of the community that lived in Marina City. And then we were lucky enough that Zoe Ryan was interested in the project, and it was shown at the Art Institute of Chicago. But that exhibition then opened up the opportunity to renovate units in Marina City. And to me, that has been a very interesting relationship, how as an architect, then, you're interested in living in a building, then share why the building is important beyond the traditional elements of, plan, section, model, it's the tallest building in the world, or this and that, and then talk through the residents of the building, why at that point, it was like 50 years after it was built, it was important, and then find the opportunity to say, hey, if you want to live in this building, you can have modern features, or like you can renovate in a way that you are respectful to the architecture and the original architect, but also make it possible to live with your lifestyle. So that has been something that we just completed our 6th renovation in the building, that I felt like it was, to me, a way to contribute with my training as an architect.
I love that. I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation, actually. So I'm going to ask you the question that I use to end all of these. What are you reading right now?
Well, I just finished reading recently the Beastie Boys
yes.
book, which I really, really enjoyed. So I really like reading biographies.
Yeah.
So I've gone through, for whatever reason lately, some of the music ones, through like the Bruce Springsteen and Dave Grohl and Beastie Boys. So and I really like the Beastie Boys, and I like reading about their history. So it was good. I actually love the structure of kind of like the official text, and then having the side notes that someone says like, well, this is bullshit, or that's not actually how I remember it. So
yeah,
that format I I really, really enjoy it. So
nice. Iker, thank you so much for doing this. I'm a fan of the way you kind of think about your work and see a lot of parallels in my own work. So it's nice to sort of pick your brain about all of this. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having it, and congratulations on an amazing show.
Oh, thank you. This episode was recorded on October 26, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.